Welcome back to the Planning Perspectives podcast. I'm Kate Duffy, joined by my co-host, Jamie Hopkins. Jamie, today we have our first guest on the podcast, which is really exciting. So let's dive in.
Yeah, excited to have Christine Benz on the show. I've known Christine for a long time. Christine is Morningstar's Director of Personal Finance. She's authored a handful of books, her most recent being How to Retire, 20 Lessons for a Happy, Successful, and Wealthy Retirement. Fun fact around that, I got to participate a little bit in that book. It's a fantastic book. She's also the co-host of Morningstar's podcast, The Long View, and she has over 2 decades of guiding millions of people through market crashes, retirement planning, and wealth building. So we couldn't be more excited to have you on the show today, Christine. Welcome.
Thank you both, Jamie and Kate. It's really a privilege to be here. Thank you. And your first guest, no less.
It's very exciting. We definitely appreciate you being with us. So let's dive right in. Let's talk about why traditional retirement planning or models are broken.
Well, one of the key reasons is that the financial underpinning for people has changed pretty dramatically over the past several decades, where we have had this stealth move from defined benefit programs, pension programs, to defined contribution. And when we look at the data, we see that a lot of people haven't gotten the message about the importance of saving for themselves for retirement. Or, maybe saying that they haven't gotten the message isn't fair, but they have not saved adequately for their retirement. So we've got a lot of people hurtling toward retirement without adequate savings, who will be exclusively reliant on Social Security. So that is an issue. And then from a lifestyle standpoint, and I know Jamie heartily agrees with this point, but the idea of retirement as a hard stop, as opposed to something that is more gradual, is pretty flawed. I think that we have a lot of people who show up in retirement, they're exhausted because they've been working so hard, and they've been thinking that, these years of their lives when they'll be retired will be their opportunity to pursue all the things that they didn't have time to do while they're working. I've just come to be a believer in how we should evangelize about kind of transitioning or phasing into retirement very gradually over a period of time. That's my plan for my own retirement. It's not always possible, of course. Some people have something that pushes them out of the workforce, or, maybe they just absolutely have to retire because they hate their jobs. But ideally, you would be phasing into retirement, and we would have employers part of this conversation where people, are making a plan to incrementally wind down their working career and move into something else.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, because I think the whole getting retirement right to some degree is getting those years before retirement right, Christine, because as you're talking about, it's this phasing in. And I see it a lot where people just burn themselves out those last 3 to 4 years. They try to cut back every expense. They try to save more. They're working really hard. They're not really enjoying working anymore. And it seems like all backwards. And you and I have talked about this before, that actually you might want to spend more during those years. You might even want to stop saving for retirement your last couple of years. Because saving, a couple $1,000s more for 3 years, really, when you run the numbers, has like almost no impact on the longevity of your retirement income or lifestyle in retirement. But people get really focused. This is what I need to do. It's right in front of me. And they go after it. And I think they're also uncomfortable about having those conversations with employers. Like, how do I phase into this? So any tips you have around those areas? Just that entering retirement phase?
Absolutely. And you make this astute point in my book, where this idea of if you can delay retirement by even a couple of years, but really try to live the good life in those years, that's the better sort of balance to strike, rather than retiring and being concerned about maybe having a shortfall in your finances. That even if it means that you aren't saving as much, well, the compounding you get, as you said, in those last years of saving doesn't add up to a lot. The tax deferral doesn't add up to a lot. So if you could take that wonderful trip with your whole family while you're still well and maybe you're still working and able to take that break. That's sort of how you should err in terms of your plan. And I also love the idea of kind of experimenting with spending in the pre-retirement phase. So I took your advice to heart, Jamie, where my husband and I were buying a car last year. He was buying a car, and normally we would pay cash for a car, but this was, really nice car that he wanted to get. And so, yeah, it was like, okay, the interest rates, we didn't want to take a loan. So we just sort of, tapped into our non-retirement portfolio, our taxable portfolio, to fund that purchase. And so your idea about practicing those big ticket expenditures just to get yourself warmed up for retirement, I think is terrific advice for people as well. And another thing I think to take to heart is if you have kind of big ticket home repairs that you're going to have to take on within the next couple of years, do it while you're working. It's going to feel better to have those big outlays coming out when you are still working than it will to, pay $25,000 or $40,000 for that roof when you're retired. So I love the idea of being gradualist about the spending plan, continuing to work if you can. And Jamie, you raised the point about engaging with your employer. I leave it to everyone to kind of decide how much they want to do that. But older workers are really good workers. So understand the value that you have in your workplace, or that you probably have, and think about having that active dialogue with your employer, where if you say, I am not loving the winters in Chicago anymore, I might like to try to be in a warmer climate for a couple months every year. If that will make working more agreeable to you, I bet your employer will be very happy to embrace that, or my guess is in many cases that will be the case. But of course, it's very individual specific.
Yeah, I might want to address that one since a lot of my team listens to it, But we have a number of people who have been phasing in and have kind of, different arrangements now. And it's one of those things, you're right. Like for the most part, right, the more experienced workers are great workers that you want to keep around for a while. So if they want to work part-time, we've got some people who work 2 to 3 days a week. We just had our COO actually phase out for a bit too, and kind of overlap with a new person coming in. And it was a really great process to do that. And so, yeah, I think, depending on your firm, it probably is different. But I think, Kate, you had, that touches on some of the, I think, ideas that we were talking about before the show too, on aging.
Yeah. So there's a couple of different points I wanted to zoom in on. And this one is practicing, which you mentioned, and also phasing out. So we know we are living longer. So do we need to think about working longer and staying in the workforce to secure our retirement? Talk a little bit about that, if you will, Christine.
Definitely, Kate. And from a financial standpoint, being able to work longer is a huge win, because if you are winnowing down the number of years that you're withdrawing from your portfolio, obviously that's hugely beneficial. Before we leave this topic of working longer, I do think that we need to be realistic and address the fact that these highly experienced workers that we're talking about often are among the highest paid workers on the employer's payroll. And so I do think, with the combination of ageism, which naturally is there, or not naturally, but it may be there, and the fact that we are talking about some higher paid workers, that might be an impediment for some people, or they might feel not super comfortable engaging with their employer with, sort of this idea of transitioning into retirement, or sort of what can you do for me? So I just wanted to address that, Kate. But absolutely from a financial standpoint, continuing to earn at least some income, and it might not even be from that highly remunerative career. It might just be doing something else that is lower pressure, where you walk out of there, you're not really thinking about the job. Maybe that is something for people to think about versus continuing to stay in their main career. But to the extent that people can forestall major portfolio withdrawals a little bit longer, that can certainly take the impact off of the retirement savings to last over, a very long time frame. I have gotten familiar with a lot of people in the FIRE community over the past 5 or so years, the Financial Independence Retire Early movement. And these are people in their 30s, 40s who are basically trying to rely on their portfolio for a really long time period. Longer than any of the retirement researchers have really looked at. And that makes me nervous when people start to talk about being retired for more than 30 years because of the combination of inflation. You don't know what market returns will be over this very long drawdown period. It just makes me a little bit worried. The ace in the hole that people have in that situation is that if they are flexible and willing to continue to work a little bit, that can make that plan a lot more doable.
That's an excellent point, definitely on the financial side. But as we talk about it, like transitioning in retirement is financial and emotional, and it affects the person who's retiring and their families. And so let's talk about the importance of relationships in retirement as we get to that point, because it's a transition and we have to utilize skills that we have both technically and on the softer side to maneuver that transition.
Absolutely. And I would say if there are some through lines in my book, that is one of them. Even people who I didn't bring on to talk about relationships mentioned the importance of relationships. There's that Harvard study that's been going on for decades now that looks at what makes us happy in our lives and gives us a sense of success in our lives. And it all comes back to who we love, who loves us. It's as simple as that. So an issue with retirement is that for some people, for many of us, a lot of our relationships and a lot of the things that put us into contact with other people, well, it relates to work. So if you haven't thought preemptively about where you will go for relationships in retirement, it's a great idea to do that. I was thinking about myself. I'm mainly a remote worker now. I go into the office maybe a couple times a month, but I was just thinking, I was in my office the other day and thinking about how good that is for my brain, actually, to like see people in the elevator and they're like, "Hi, Christine." And I'm like, "Do I know you?" And all of the small talk conversations that you might have, maybe 100 interactions in a day, at least in my office. We're a pretty big company. How good that is for the neurological functioning of my brain to have to process all that stuff in a very short period of time. So I think it's super important for people to think about their typical days in retirement and build in those opportunities to run into people, to connect with people, to work on things with people. And it's certainly volunteer projects can be really valuable in this context, going to the gym and connecting with other people. There are lots of opportunities once you step away from work, but you do need to be thoughtful about where you will go for those work connections. And a couple people mentioned in my book how men oftentimes struggle with this a bit more than women, in part because many of them do have a lot of their social connections coming through the workplace, and they might not have as many social connections elsewhere. So men especially, and of course this is a huge generalization, but be preemptive on this front.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And as I reflect in some of my own things, I was a remote worker halfway across the country from the office for about 6 years. And I didn't always notice it, but there was later in that time period of that role, I realized that like my best days were still the days where I was like in the office around everybody than when I was remote. And I'm in 5 days a week now. I never work at home anymore. It just maybe for an hour or two when there's something going on, but I go in really every single day. And to your point, it is a lot of those small things. You're just passing somebody in the hallway, in the elevator, walking in or out of the building, and especially the people that I otherwise wouldn't run into, right? They're not in my meetings, they're not in my teams. And so I just would never see them outside of being copied on a larger company email. And I think those are important interactions. And even this morning on my way in here, I stopped at a coffee shop. I actually ran into somebody I knew, right, who just happened to be getting coffee right there. We talked for 5 minutes standing in the line and like that. But if you don't go out and you say, hey, I just make my coffee at home, that interaction disappears. And so even small things, I think, if you read the news on your tablet or your new laptop, maybe sometimes in retirement, it's good to just go do that outside of the house instead of just being inside the house for some of those normal activities.
I love that point. And there's a little bit of physical activity there too, right? Getting out of your house. And that is another through line in my book, is just the importance of physical activity. In fact, Laura Karstensen makes the point that, and she writes and talks a lot about relationships in our lives, but she's like, getting outside in nature with another person, that ticks a lot of boxes about what we know about longevity, what keeps people well longer, getting outside, being with other people, and having some level of physical activity.
Yeah, it's great. So I'm going to shift us a little bit out of that behavioral part back to a topic that you and I have discussed many times, but Morningstar does great research on this. You help lead that up. But talking about the 4%, Bill Bengen's research going back to the 1990s and continue to reevaluate that. So I think a lot of people will be somewhat familiar with this. It's probably one of the most well-known, at least on the fringes of it, topic in the retirement distribution space and retirement space. But this notion, right, that what can you spend from your investment portfolio? And it was found back in 1994, published back then, that, if you had this 50-50 portfolio, historically, you could get a little bit over 4% out of it, right? Everyone just rounded it down to 4, but I think it was actually like 4.16 or something around there, right? It's a tad bit over. But that's become the rule of thumb for distributions. But I think the outstanding question is, does that hold up over time? What are all the different idiosyncrasies, all the little, I guess, wrinkles in this one too, because it was a very structured research project and finding back when it came out.
Yeah, it's such a rich area to dive into, and our team annually does do some research on this topic. The 4% spending guideline, as you said, Jamie, is quite rigid in terms of the assumptions that it makes. So it's basically saying I'm going to take 4% of whatever my portfolio value is at the beginning of retirement, and then I'm basically going to put blinders on. I will never waver. I'll give myself an inflation adjustment to that initial dollar amount. But beyond that, my plan is to just stick with that spending. And when we do our simulations, what we see is that in many, many market environments, that leads to significant underspending because it's built for a worst case scenario. It's built for an environment where stock returns are bad, bond returns are bad, maybe both. Because Bengen's research looks back over history to arrive at that 4% guideline and basically asks the question, well, what if I happen to retire in the worst case scenario in market history? And I drew down on my portfolio over 30 years in this fashion without ever wavering. And that's the conclusion, that 4% is a safe spending rate if you're thinking about worst case scenarios. Well, market environments aren't worst case scenarios. So when we look at our research, we actually look at the portfolio balance that is left over if someone is embarking on a given spending strategy, because we think that's important. If someone leaves a lot at the end of their lives, that's under consumption. And maybe they'll say that's fine and that can go for my heirs or charity or whatever. But for people with tight plans, that underconsumption has pretty significant implications for how they're leading their lives in retirement. So when we do our research, we look forward, we embed our forecasts about what we expect stock and bond returns to be. We're pretty conservative from that standpoint. So we do a variety of different sorts of tests where we look at different retirement spending systems. I think most of us who work on the project would say, if you can be flexible with your retirement spending, if you can not just put blinders on and actually react to what's going on in your portfolio, spend more. When the market's good, maybe spend a little bit less. When it's not so good, that's a better strategy. So if people are thinking about retirement spending, 4% isn't a bad starting point, but ideally you would build in a little bit of an ability to adjust. And this is a whole separate tangent, but when we look at the data from my former colleague, David Blanchett, for example, on actual retirement spending, people don't tend to take an inflation adjustment as the years go by. They tend to spend a little bit less on an inflation adjusted basis as they age. So I think that's an important part of this as well, and should give people permission to maybe spend a little bit more earlier if they're okay with that trade-off, that they'll spend less as they age.
Yeah, and it's a good point. And you look at some of the research that was done in kind of the great financial crisis and recession, and if you look at high inflationary periods, this is another thing I always talk about on this, is when inflation spikes up, when you look at that historical kind of analysis in the 4% finding, you assume that people just adjust for that. And I'm like, but that's not based in any reality, because the whole point of when inflation is spiking is people change their spending. Like that's like exactly what's happening in those time periods. Like there is no example of high inflationary periods where everybody just inflationary adjusts and spends up, right? Like in any setting in the history of the world, that spending changes during high inflationary time periods. So if that really happens in your retirement, what do people do? They do find ways to cut back in more discretionary areas. And that is, just a macro thing, but it's a really hard thing to model. So it doesn't really show up in the research, but in a practical sense, we do know that long periods of high inflation, people will change their spending habits.
100%. And 2022, I think, was a great example of that, where we had, bad stock returns, bad bond returns, high inflation. My guess is that in reaction to that, many retirees probably did change their spending a bit. So I think that's a super astute point.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Christine. We are so glad that you joined us today. We have one last question for you. If you could pick one piece of advice from your book, with the exception of Jamie's, what would it be? What would you share with us today?
I would say, and we've touched on this, Kate, already, but just really nurturing those relationships. And Laura Karstensen in the book makes such an astute point that as we age, our social networks do winnow down a little bit. Some maybe less happy reasons, but maybe people moving away or getting sick, and or perhaps even passing away. But her point, I think, is super comforting, that you always want to be nurturing that network of people who you, where the friendships you value the most highly. And her point is that even just small points of contact, a little text saying, "Oh, I saw this in TJ Maxx and thought of you," or whatever it might be, those small points of contact are enough to kind of move relationships along. So don't let them go fallow. Just do everything you can to keep those relationships alive, and face-to-face contact, as much as some of these virtual interactions are really decent replacement for them, there's no real replacement for that one-on-one human physical contact. So I think that's a key piece of advice that I plan to bring into my own retirement, just valuing the important relationships in my life and putting the time and thought into keeping them really well.
I love how, Christine, you're starting to live all these values and learnings about retirement, because you've been talking about it, studying it, and now you're starting to implement a lot of these. So I love to see that.
Well, I had unfortunately been toiling just on the financial piece, and I realized that the non-financial piece is actually the bigger piece for a lot of us. So it's been really eye-opening and fun to explore all these different dimensions of retirement planning.
Well, Christine, it was a pleasure to have you on the show today and talk to you. Thank you for sharing such great information with all of the listeners here. For those who want to find more out about you or the work that you're doing at Morningstar, what are some of the best places for them to go?
Yeah, so Morningstar.com. I'm on there almost every day doing videos and articles. The podcast that you two referenced is called The Long View. We've been doing it for, like 6 years now, a weekly podcast that's an interview like this with a thought leader. And then the book is called How to Retire, which has contributions from a lot of retirement thought leaders, including you, Jamie. So thank you for being part of the book.
Yeah, well, thank you for all the great work you do. Kate, great job. Thank you for being here on the show again today with me.
Thank you, Jamie. It's always great to be here.
And thank you, everyone else, for tuning in to the Planning Perspectives podcast. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen or watch your favorite podcast. Feel free to reach out to us at any time or give us a call. You can go to bmt.com to find more of our information, and we'll put links to all the things that were referenced here in the show notes. And until next time, thank you for watching.
Thank you for listening to the Planning Perspectives podcast. Don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes are available. Visit our website at www.bmt.com or call us at 833-973-7633. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision. Investments, not a deposit, not FDIC insured, not insured by any federal government agency, not guaranteed by the bank, may go down in value.